Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We help sophisticated investors earn better risk-adjusted returns. We work on a subscription basis. One of our favorite things to do at Deep Knowledge Investing is to highlight the expertise of the members of our board of advisors. Today, we're going to be speaking with Michael Kliegman. He has an incredible background. He spent more than 35 years of experience in tax-efficient planning. He was a group chief in the Internal Revenue Service National Office. He was a partner in the New York Mergers and Acquisitions Group at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he is senior counsel at Akin Gump. There are a lot of concerns right now regarding the Biden tax plan. On the first debate, Joe Biden came out, former Vice President Biden came out and said he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts. And there are a lot of people right now concerned about what a Biden tax plan would look like for their portfolios and for their personal finances. We want to point out that this call is being recorded. If anyone is uncomfortable with that, you can feel free to disconnect. We also want to make two very important disclaimers. The first one is today's observations reflect Michael Kliegman's observations only. His opinions are his and not those of Akin Gump or PricewaterhouseCoopers. The second one is neither Michael Kliegman nor Gary Brode nor Deep Knowledge Investing are making a prediction about who's going to win the presidential election. For those of you who are interested in that topic, tune in next week and we'll be talking about that. But for this call, we are not making any predictions. The assumption here that we're going to be talking about today would be you have a Biden win, the Democrats retain the House, and gain a majority in the Senate. Again, we are not making a prediction for that. We're just talking about what the implications of that outcome would be. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gary. Just working off of that, taxes have not been a significant part of the Biden pitch, shall we say, in contrast to 4 years ago, where we had a tax plan from Donald Trump was laid out with some degree of specificity, and indeed that was against the background of the House of Representatives having a very highly developed tax plan developed by policy wonks led by Paul Ryan, and so it was a real issue in the campaign, and for that matter, after the election, there was a relatively easy ramp. At least for setting forth what the goals would be for a Trump administration, which, by the way, flip side of our assumption here was Republican White House, Republican House, and Republican majority Senate. Here, when we try to determine what a Biden tax plan would be, we glean it from a little bit in the platform, very little, and more from speeches, some of which were during the primary campaigns where, to put it mildly, I think we always have to take with a grain of salt what is said in the heat of that battle in particular. Nevertheless, there's some pretty good working understandings about what we're going to be what we are going to be seeing. There are two stated reasons why Biden presumably is going to want to raise taxes. One of them, he's going to need to raise revenue for spending plans. Maybe not enough revenue for the spending, but to make a substantial reduction in the net budgetary impact. And second is campaign promises, statements made by him, by Kamala Harris in the campaign about rolling back the Trump tax cuts, making the corporations and rich pay more. And he's going to have to, at least from a political standpoint, deliver on that to some extent. One other comment about, by way of introduction, those stated objectives are likely to be tempered to some extent. And this is an important subject of debate, and it's speculative debate about how influential moderate Democrats will be, especially in the Senate, in tempering the extremity of some of these potential tax increases. And another tempering effect, which is less subject to debate because it's out there, is concerns that Biden and his allies will have about making it even more difficult to revive the economy. That it's likely that in a few months we're still going to be struggling, and so that's going to be a concern, and certainly going to be a rhetorical tool for those who are arguing against more extreme tax increases to use.
Okay, so you were just talking about the Senate, Michael. Let's talk about what the implications are for getting tax legislation through the Senate. How relevant is the filibuster? Will the Democrats need Republican assistance to pass anything? Is any compromise going to be required to get anything done here?
Right. So the filibuster is now in everybody's vocabulary, more or less. It's the way they do business in the Senate. It is a requirement. Under Senate rules, any senator can hold up movement on legislation by basically just getting up in the chamber and talking, hence the verb filibustering. And what that means in practice is that the party that wants to delay, perhaps indefinitely, movement on legislation can do that as a party. You need 60 votes in the Senate for a closure to stop the filibuster and move the bill along, which is why, generally speaking, in order for one party to dominate what happens in the Senate, the way it works in the House is with 60 votes, which nobody thinks we're going to have for the Democrats or the Republicans, and we rarely see. So that filibuster is key. Until Senate Majority Leader Reid eliminated the filibuster for judicial nominations, it was applicable to judicial nominations. And then a few years later, the Republicans extended that for Supreme Court. But as we speak right now, the filibuster really prevents one party from dominating. There's been a lot of talk about what the Democrats will do, maybe eliminate the filibuster entirely in order to back the Supreme Court, make Puerto Rico the District of Columbia states, and do lesser things perhaps. So that's an open question. They will not have to end the filibuster to push through tax legislation. The reason is they have another tool available under current rules called budget reconciliation. That is the tool that the Republicans used in 2017 to pass the 2017 tax legislation without a single Democratic vote in either house. That's a complicated tool. It has certain rules, but it will allow the Democrats to do most of what they might want to do in the way of tax legislation without Republican votes in the Senate, and without worrying about the filibuster and without having to change the filibuster.
Okay, so the key point here is that if the Democrats have Joe Biden occupying the White House and a majority in the Senate, they can push through the tax plan they want without having to break the filibuster. I think that's what you're saying.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, yeah. So let's move on to timing. I know there's been talk early on that this would be the kind of tax legislation, and an increase in taxes is something that the Democrats would get to right away. They're talking about it being, you know, a first 100 days kind of thing. So two questions to you. One, what do you see as the likely timing for some sort of tax legislation, again, under the conditions we're discussing? And two, can they or would they make it retroactive to Jan 1 of 2021, or would we be looking at a different start date, giving people a little bit of time to adjust to a new tax regime?
Right. I think this is probably the most important issue, for obvious reasons. And by the way, I've seen, we were involved with an M&A transaction a month or so ago where the sellers were getting back stock, and it was going to close this year, and they wanted to make sure that it was taxable. And even though we actually had to work hard to make it taxable, kind of like breaking into jail, but I wouldn't say that's the norm. So despite the political talk about day one, I'm going to repeal it, or even the first 100 days, the process of moving tax legislation is difficult and slow. You can't run it through. You can't run it through quickly. There are a number of reasons why that's the case. But by the way, I mentioned the 2016 race and the 2017 tax legislation, despite the fact that the Republicans had House, Senate, and the White House, and they, to some extent, to a large degree, ran on the tax proposals. They weren't able to get it done until December of 2017. And it's our legislative history is filled with similar examples of where it takes a long time. The White House is going to have to fill jobs. It's going to have to fill an assistant Treasury Secretary for tax policy, and they're going to make proposals. It'll be probably a few months before that happens. And to make a long story short, it's highly unlikely that we'll see tax legislation until sometime in the second half of 2021. How late, I'm not sure, but it's I would think well into the fall. That's just what history teaches us, and there's no reason to think that that in this case it's going to move any faster. As far as effective dates are concerned, very, very unlikely that there would be a retroactive effective date, that they pass legislation in the fall of 2021 that increases tax rates, as well as making other changes, mostly adverse to all sorts of taxpayers, and have that retroactive to January 1st.
Okay.
I don't see that as a realistic possibility, which means we're most likely to see January 1, 2022 effective date. And what I think that means is we don't have to have a lot of anxiety this fall about taking actions to beat the deadline, to beat the clock before January 1, 2021 effective date of all kinds of bad things.
All right, so basically what you're saying is calendar 2021 is going to be an active year for tax preparers and financial planners and everybody putting a tax shelter together. Let's talk about the implications of the policies that have been discussed. And I know you said earlier in this call that the Democrats have not been clear with specifically what their plan is going to be. The one thing we have heard definitively is former Vice President Biden has said he will repeal the Trump tax cuts. What are the implications of that, both for corporations, individuals, and for people who own equities like just about everybody on this call?
Right. So let's first talk about corporations and to some degree other business taxes, because I was surprised. I guess I shouldn't be, at how strong the anti-corporate rhetoric was in the Democratic debates, and that's toned down some since then, since Biden got the nomination, but it continues to be strong. And so one thing we know that's been pretty definitive coming out of Joe Biden is wants to raise the rate from 21 to 28. Recall it was 35 prior to the 2017 Tax Act. That's simple enough. People I talk to who are more in the know than I am, closer to the legislative process, think that there's a reasonable possibility it may not go quite that high. It might go somewhere in between. China's tax rate is 25%. I don't know that that's gonna be a key point, but the fact is, there was a very strong consensus among Democrats and Republicans behind, I'm going to say, most of the corporate tax changes that we got in 2017. You'd never know it because of the, but what was in the Republican tax law changes in 2017 was strongly supported in almost all of its aspects, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute, by Democrat as well as Republican tax policy people, and there were political issues that stood in the way. There was a broad consensus that the rate needed to come down. 35 put us at maybe the highest tax rate in the world. It was agreed we needed to be somewhere probably below 28%. But anyway, so we may end up at 25. What is the international tax changes require a little bit more discussion. Our prior approach, and again, you wouldn't know it from the rhetoric, but the way U.S. multinationals were taxed on their foreign earnings before the Trump tax cuts was generally you didn't pay tax in the U.S. on foreign income earned by your foreign subsidiaries until it was repatriated. So, and it was easier until several years ago, and it's going to get less and less easy to structure your foreign operations to pay very low tax rates. But generally, U.S. multinationals, and Apple was one of the the poster children for this, would earn a lot of money overseas, pay little tax, and not have to pay U.S. tax until it was repatriated. When you take back a dividend, you're then going to pay the U.S. tax subject to a foreign tax credit. So what most U.S. multinationals historically did was didn't repatriate it. And by the way, from a book standpoint, financial statement standpoint, they would consolidate the foreign earnings and not provide U.S. taxes on those foreign earnings based upon an assertion that those earnings were permanently reinvested overseas. Which is why you had despite a 35% tax rate, and despite the fact that ostensibly we tax it when it comes back, you had very low effective tax rates for U.S. multinationals.
Right.
Well,
If the money isn't coming back, then you're collecting a very high tax rate on something close to $0.
Yeah, if you don't bring it back, then yeah. So what there was, again, broad consensus, Democrats and Republicans, that needed to change. Number one, our tax system was different than almost other industrialized countries. They all had some variation on a so-called territorial system, which, broadly speaking, said the home country, in this case the US, isn't ever going to tax income that's earned in other jurisdictions, and again, Democrats and Republicans generally supported that. So that's the general approach of the 2017 tax law, which is you earn money overseas. When you bring it back, you don't have to pay tax on it. But there's a big exception. The people in Congress and in the Treasury Department that put together this very supposedly very taxpayer-friendly tax reform legislation said, well, you know what, that's maybe too generous and maybe too prone to abuse, because we don't want U.S. companies shifting income to other jurisdictions, paying little tax on it, and then bring it back tax-free. So we have this provision, the acronym for which is GILTI, Global Intangible Low Tax Income. The GILTI tax, the idea there is that U.S. companies are going to pay a current income tax on certain kinds of income earned in their foreign subsidiaries. And by the way, the definition of GILTI income is very broad. And I'm not going to get into it unless people really want to, as to what that is, but it's not the exception, it's become the rule. It acts as sort of a minimum tax. So we have got a regular corporate tax rate of 21%. The GILTI tax is half that, or 10.5%. So whereas before our tax rate was higher in the US and we nominally tax it when it comes back, but it never came back, under current tax law since 2017, we've got a lower domestic tax rate in the US, and we will currently tax income of foreign subsidiaries, but at a reduced rate of 10.5%.
Okay,
so
Michael, let me just stop you for one quick second, please, and make sure that the people listening understand. The reason this is important is because when the money that earned overseas by US corporations stays overseas, you have two issues. One is that the United States government is collecting no tax on that. Two is that money can't be repatriated and used for investment in the US or to pay dividends, stock buyback, basically capital reallocation in ways that might help American workers, American industry, American stockholders. This is why these are important issues. So Michael, let me ask you, if the current GILTI rate, I think you said is 10.5%, under a Biden tax plan, where do you think that rate goes?
He's talking about raising that to 21%. Raising the regular corporate tax rate to 28, and this what I'll call minimum tax on most kinds of overseas income to 21%.
Okay, and then for tax on book income and capital investment incentives, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So Biden's also talked about wanting to make sure that all companies pay tax, and he holds up Amazon as the poster child of a company making billions of dollars in book income, financial statement reported income, and paying little or no income tax. So he's proposing, and this is sort of more things change and more they stay the same. Basically an alternative minimum tax. He hasn't called it that yet, but a minimum tax of 15% on a company's book income. And that's going to be a lot of work to work that out. Again, all the more reason why it's going to take time before Congress passes anything. But they can look at what was done in 1986, where we had a similar provisions. And so that's going to be interesting. And by the way, that's going to conflict. The reason, one of the main reasons we have this disparity where you have companies with book income not paying tax is because the tax code is filled with still various incentives to do things. Accelerated depreciation. We used to have investment tax credit. Biden wants to add a made in America tax credit for 10% on U.S. job creating investments. So those kinds of incentives are in the tax law, but not in the financial in the accounting rules. So there's going to be that conflict. But this is a political campaign. It's, you know, the hard work's going to be for the people who are going to try to figure this out in the details. So the AMT, yes. We have this bonus depreciation provision that we got at the end of 2017, which I'll editorialize. To me, that was icing on the cake we didn't need, but it was popular. So we've got highly accelerated depreciation that is set to expire in the end of 2026. We've heard nothing from the Biden people about whether they want to keep that or get rid of it. So who knows?
All right. Well, Michael, let's move off the corporate issues for a minute, and let's address some questions people have about their individual taxes. There are certain elements of the Trump tax cuts that are scheduled to sunset in the next few years. I know Republicans want to make them permanent. What do you see happening for individuals in this area?
Right. So what Biden is proposing is to restore the highest rate. So 2017. I mean, the rate structure moved down generally, but the top rate was reduced from 39.6 to 37%. Biden wants to raise that back to 39.6. Bear in mind, when we talk about investment income, as we will in a moment, we have a 3.8% net investment income tax that was added by the Obamacare law that you should add to whatever the tax rate is for investment income. One thing we got in the 2017 tax law, one of the things that held up tax reform before, that's a lot of us thought we were going to get tax reform before 2017, was what about the closely held, and particularly pass-throughs? So if we reduce the corporate tax from 35 to something in the 20s for the big companies, the vast majority and politically very popular and historically strong politically closely held businesses are pass-throughs where the tax rate is the individual rate. So the response was, okay, you're going to, Apple's going to pay a 28% rate, and my little business, because it's a pass-through, we're going to pay 39.6. So hence we got this section 199A deduction that was key to unlocking that in 2017 for pass-throughs. For most kinds of businesses, except mine. I mean, not available for law, accounting, and medicine, and some others. But that reduces the effective rate for closely held businesses from 37% to 29.6%. Biden is proposing to phase out that deduction for owners with incomes above $400,000. That $400,000 number, you've probably heard it. That's his number. That's his promise that he keeps reiterating, that if you make less than $400,000, nothing bad's going to happen to you. If you make more, you're going to have bad things happen. Phase out of that is one of them. He also wants to reduce the benefits of that deduction for the real estate industry, as well as some other favorable tax rules for the real estate industry as well. Capital gains. Capital gains rate for long-term capital gains and dividends for individuals right now is 20%, again, plus the 3.8 net investment income. He hasn't talked about changing that, except for those with incomes over $1 million. He says he's going to eliminate it entirely. So he's saying if your income's over $1 million, your long-term capital gains and dividends are going to be taxed at your ordinary rate of 39.6%. People I talk to think that it's likely to end up being compromised at something less, but there's a pretty good chance that the principle is still going to be there of a higher rate of tax, significantly higher rate of tax on long-term capital gains dividends at that higher income level.
It also sounds like you're a little skeptical that everyone making less than $400,000 a year will be unaffected by the changes in tax law.
Well, once they get, one of the things that they're going to need to do when they sit down to draft it and to figure out what the revenue impact is going to be is see what's this going to cost. He's saying, he seems to be saying $400,000 individual. I don't know that he's unequivocally said individual as opposed to married filing jointly. There's another non-investment point that you may have heard about is he wants to raise the Social Security tax, not the Medicare, that's already been done in the past. But right now, your Social Security FICA caps at incomes of $137,700. So the next dollar you make after that, you're not going to have Social Security tax. He wants to change that, but starting at $400,000 of income, which is going to create a so-called donut hole. Might as well you learn the lingo. So ostensibly, between $138,000 of income and $399,900, you're not going to have any FICA, but then it's going to start up again when you hit $400,000. So two things about that. One, you may have seen so an op-ed the other day in the Wall Street Journal pointing out that nothing said about indexing that for inflation. So as one's income increases, if you're making $350,000, it won't be long before you're in that. But the other point, going back to the process and effective dates that I mentioned earlier, Social Security changes cannot be made via the budget reconciliation process. So this may well be on Biden's agenda, but I don't expect it to be in any legislation that gets passed in 2021. More likely, God forbid anybody should actually say, let's talk about entitlements, but if they say they want to do something about Social Security, maybe some other set of some other process that results in doing that.
All right, Michael. We're starting to get some really interesting questions coming in through the chat function. By the way, just a reminder to everyone else who's on the call, if you have questions, you can send them to Shay. He'll relay them on to me. So Michael, we're going to go to our version of the lightning round here. Last 3 questions from Deep Knowledge Investing, then we'll go to the viewer questions. Quickly, any comments on the wealth tax? Elizabeth Warren's talked about it. Other Democrats have talked about it. The state of California has talked about it. Where do you see that going?
Right. So while nominally not accepted verbally or otherwise by Biden, Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, who is the leading Democrat and former chair of the Senate Finance Committee, he actually a few years ago was very interested and was working on what I'll call a mark-to-market approach to capital gains that would eliminate the realization requirement, which is not identical to a wealth tax, but pretty similar. No indication from Biden that he's interested in that, but that could be a sleeper. Okay.
And what about estate and gift taxes?
Right. So again, just a little bit of rhetoric about it. He wants to cut back. There's been a significant increase in the exemption amount the last couple of rounds of tax legislation. So right now it's about 11.5 million for a couple. He wants to reduce that, and that's frankly that there'll be a lot of pushback on that, and my guess is they'll reduce it by some amount. But the bigger change that he has proposed is to eliminate the step up in basis at death. Right now, at death, the basis of all property that owned by the decedent gets stepped up to fair market value. He wants to change that to carryover basis. That was done in 1976, and it ultimately was repealed. It never got off the ground. But I think if there's enough of a will, there might be a way to make that happen. Gotcha. So there's a lot of concern about that.
So we're now going to go to some of our listener questions. One great one from Dr. Somi Chimpada. He is the CEO of Chelsea Health Solutions and also a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. He wants your opinion on what will happen with the SALT deduction. Hey, Somi. And I know one of the key elements to this, Michael, is in the hypothetical scenario we're talking about, you would almost certainly have Nancy Pelosi from California as the Speaker of the House. And should the Democrats take the Senate, it probably would be Chuck Schumer from New York as the Senate Majority Leader. What happens to the SALT taxes?
Right. Well, you loaded it there appropriately. I want to say, no, I don't want to say because I live in a high tax state, but I'd be inclined to say that it's too expensive, that they've got a lot of other things they want to pay for. But with California and New York running the House and Senate, and Kamala Harris, as vice president, who might have some influence, I would expect to see a partial, if not full, lifting of the SALT cap, and that's just for that very reason. There's a lot of bitterness about that in terms of regional competition. It's not even class, because the beneficiaries of no SALT cap are largely higher income people, but in these blue states.
Right. Okay. And a question from Chris Bell from Horizon Connects, also a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. He's got the change-up question of the day. If President Trump wins re-election and Republicans hold the Senate, do you see a continuation of the current tax policy, or do you think the president with a renewed Senate majority would try to make some other changes in terms of the tax rates?
I think what we can expect to see if that happens is some of the provisions in the 2017 Tax Act, including the lowering of rates for individuals and some other provisions that have expiration dates because of the budgetary rules they were working under, that there will be an effort to make those permanent. Trump talks about reducing the corporate tax rate further, but I don't see blowing political capital on that.
Okay, got it. Well, Michael, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for all of your insight on this. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all for listening.
Everyone, you can disconnect now. Thanks so much for being part of the call today.